Hi everyone, and thank you for tuning in. I'm sure you've just completed Helen's video from our group for self-justification from Experiment 1. My name is Tori, and I'm here to talk to you about Experiment number 2. So my experiment was done in 1955, and there were 112 participants in Palo Alto, California. All subjects were contacted between the same hours of the day, 1:30 and 4:30 p.m., and there was one female experimenter and one male. And unlike the first subject, ours was done face-to-face, so it was door-to-door rather than on the phone. They tried to pick subjects that were homogeneous in nature, so similar in language barriers and economics. In the neighborhood on each block, every third or fourth home was chosen, and the fifth was left as the control group. Each block was involved in the same experiment. This was just in case of the likelihood that the neighbors would talk to each other about the person that had stopped by and what they were asking for. Throughout the experiment, the two conducting the experiment did not talk to each other about the results or whom they contacted. The very first group was contacted, and they were told that the experimenter was visiting a number of homes in order to attempt to make citizens more aware of the importance of safety in driving. The simple request was to ask them to display a small black and white sign that simply said, "Be a safe driver." It was a very small sign that would either go in their car window or their home window. If they agreed, he gave them the sign and thanked them. If they disagreed, they simply thanked them for the time, and that was the end of the experiment. He told them that he was from a committee called the Community Committee for Traffic Safety. The three other experiments that were conducted were very similar in manner. The organization was identified as the Keep California Beautiful Committee, and their sign said exactly that, Keep California Beautiful. Both petition groups were asked to sign either a petition that would go to U.S. senators that would help to lobby for legislation that would regard either safe driving or keeping California beautiful. Subjects were shown a petition that was very neat in order. It was bound on very nice paper and already included at least 20 signatures by the time each individual was shown it. If they signed, they were thanked for their time. If they didn't sign, they were also thanked for their time, and that was the end of the contact. The second contact was then made about 2 weeks after the initial one, and each experimenter was given a list of the homes that had been approached, but they weren't told whether the person at each home had complied or denied with the initial request. In this experiment, every person was asked the same thing. They were asked if they would be willing to let the company place a large sign in their front yard that simply said, "Safe driving." This time, they both said they were from the Citizens for Safe Driving. So this was a different name than the first, although no one actually pointed it out to the experimenters. The subject was shown a picture of this very large sign that simply said, "Drive carefully," and the picture showed it placed in front of a very nice home, although the sign was placed in a manner that did obstruct the view of the front door of the home. They were told that men would come out to post the sign. They were told there would be zero damage to their lawn, and that once it was done, the same people would come out and remove the sign. So very little commitment on the part of the homeowners. They were told the sign would be up for a week to a week and a half tops. The experiment ended by telling them they were gathering more names than possibly needed, so there's a good chance they wouldn't actually need use of their yard, but if they did, they would be contacted within 2 weeks. They were then thanked for their time, no matter what the response, and the experiment was ended. In the results, it showed that if someone agreed to the first request, it was far more likely that they would agree to the second, larger request. In the control group of the fifth house homeowners that weren't contacted, less than 20% agreed to let the large sign be placed. However, in the group of people that had asked and complied with the first initial smaller request, over 55% of the homeowners complied to the larger sign, the larger request. It also showed that if the similar request initially was something that was similar to the second larger request, that people were far more likely to comply. So what this means is that if the initial request, they were asked to hang a small sign, then they complied with that. It means that the chance of them agreeing to the second larger request of a sign was much more likely. This holds true even when the second request was made weeks later and potentially by a completely different person. In summary, it is reasonable to assume that if an individual agrees to a smaller task, that they are tend to have a more of a larger buy-in to committing to a second larger request. These results are similar to that of the first experiment, although in the first experiment, the same person made both the smaller initial request and the second larger request. So this would affect the likelihood as well, because they already had a familiarity with that person asking them something and complying. In the second study, this effect was quite strong when the second request was made by a different person. However, it's believed that the buy-in had to do with the fact that the requests were similar in nature. Two possibilities were established, first being the matter of principle. This was centered on the particular type of action, so as we just discussed, they were willing to hang up a small sign in the first request, which made it easier for them to comply to hanging a larger sign in the second request. The second principle is the notion of involvement. This simply states that once someone has agreed to an action, no matter how small, they tend to feel more involved than they did before and therefore possibly more compliant to the second request. The basic idea is that the change in attitude need not be towards any particular issue, any particular person, or towards any particular activity, but it could be towards the compliance in general. It's also important to take into consideration that these requests were small requests made by non-profit organizations, and they were very non-controversial subject matter. So it wasn't anything political or religious or anything that could potentially put the homeowner and having to take a stance on something. In conclusion, this experiment definitely raises some questions for me. One major one being that this was conducted in 1955. So back then, over the phone and face-to-face were very common practice. Now it makes me wonder, are we as apt to open the door and to respond to strangers since we live in a very electronic world? Secondly, do we still trust the same as we did as a society did back then as we do now? I often wonder, were the decisions made based on whether the neighbors wondered what their other neighbors had done? Did anyone that say no eventually feel guilty in saying no to a basic request involving public safety? Did anyone say no merely based on the aesthetics of the sign and the fact that it would block the view of their home, and they worked hard to make their home look presentable? Lots of questions always come up whenever I watch experiments, and we've had some great experiments in this class, and hopefully this has brought some questions to mind for all of you. Thank you very much for listening to our group discuss self-justification. We hope you enjoyed all of this information and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.